Let's go now to the final in this 2015 ABC Boyer Lecture Series. Michael Fullilove, as all of you here I'm sure know, is a foreign affairs expert. He's an historian, he's an author, and he's currently the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy. In this four-part lecture series, A Larger Australia, Michael's laid out his vision for the kind of country Australia is and should aspire to be at a time when the world is shifting and changing, and our place within it needs to be readjusted, perhaps even reimagined. At a time of such realignment, this is a theme running right through this lecture series, and Michael makes a passionate plea for Australia to maintain a strong and robust position on the world stage. In the first of the Boyer Lectures, present at the Destruction, which, as Jim told us, was delivered at Peking University in Beijing, Michael explained how the world order, in place since the Second World War, is crumbling. And this coincides, of course, with the shift of wealth and power from the west to the east, placing Australia in a new and more precarious position, but also poised to take strategic and economic advantage of the good fortune of our geography. In the second lecture, which is called A Three-Dimensional Foreign Policy, Michael sets out the argument for the need for Australia to keep three balls in the air, so to speak: alliance management, regional engagement, and institutional involvement on the world stage. And in the third Boyer Lecture, titled Foreign Policy Begins at Home, he asks us to get our own house in order. We need a larger politics and some big thinking on the economy in order to respond to global challenges like immigration and climate policy, and big thinking on our own identity too. Bravery, courage, I think, is a theme through these lectures. If you could please now welcome Dr. Michael Fullilove to deliver the final in this 2015 Boyer Lecture Series. It's called The Birthplace of the Fortunate.
Your Excellency David Hurley, Governor of New South Wales, Jim Spiegelman, Chairman of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and Mark Scott, Managing Director of the ABC, Frank Lowy, Chairman of the Lowy Institute, David Lowy, David Gonski, Board Members of the Institute, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's often said that Australia is a middle power, but there's nothing middling about Australia. There are 200-odd countries in the world. On every important measure except population, we rank in the top 10 or 20. Our economy is the 12th largest in the world. Our people are the 5th richest. Australia is an old democracy and a free society. We are allied to the global leader and located in the most dynamic region in the world. Our diaspora is 1 million strong, our own worldwide web of ideas and influence. We have a continent to ourselves, and we are fortunate enough to share it with the oldest continuing culture on Earth. Australia is not a middle power. Australia is a significant power with regional and global interests, and we should act like one. In the coming years, we face a testing set of international circumstances. I argued in my last lecture that we should prepare ourselves by getting our house in order, but we should also enlarge our approach to the world. This begins with a larger debate about our country's place in the world. The coming changes will affect all Australians, and we should include all Australians in the discussion of them. The foreign policy debate is too important to be left to the foreign policy establishment. A robust debate requires high-quality information and analysis. We should not have to rely on the homogenised worldview of international media organisations. Australian journalists understand Australian interests. They also bring a particular Australian sensibility to their work. Unfortunately, just as the world demands more of our attention, we are giving it less, recalling our foreign correspondents and closing our foreign bureaus. In the past decade, Australian media organisations have significantly reduced their presence in Washington, New York, Brussels, Moscow, London, Jerusalem, Auckland, Bangkok, New Delhi, Tokyo and Port Moresby. Ask yourself, has our need for analysis from these places lessened? The number of Australian foreign correspondents is small and shrinking. Our newspapers increasingly take their international news from foreign titles. Our commercial broadcasters are more interested in Buckingham Palace than Bangkok or Beijing. The only Australian media organisation that still retains a substantial international presence is the ABC, and even its ranks have thinned. Of course, the national broadcaster has always led the way in foreign coverage. Half a century ago, in his 1963 Boyer Lectures, Professor J.D.B. Miller observed that the ABC has doggedly persisted with the task of interesting people in international issues, in spite of bluster from cheap politicians. Does that ring a bell? It is imperative to the national interest that we keep Australian journalists on the global beat. If that means fewer stories about private schools and house prices, well, sacrifices must be made. Better international coverage would help to elevate the foreign policy debate at home, which is not what it should be. International issues rarely attract the discussion they merit. The world tends to be reduced to a few totemic issues, such as asylum seekers. In the future, I suspect, we will have greater threats with which to contend than leaky boats. Furthermore, the tone of Australian commentary on international relations betrays a persistent strain of self-doubt. Too often, we regard ourselves as onlookers or cheerleaders, not players. Let me cite a few examples of this tendency. I mentioned in my second lecture the peculiar little debate we had on whether we should run for the UN Security Council, even though the value of council membership was self-evident. The routine criticism of overseas travel by ministers is another example of small country thinking. The general assumption seems to be that ministers travelling abroad on our country's business are either big noters or routers. Recall the breathless reporting a few years ago of the overseas travel racked up by foreign ministers. This is what it's come to, I thought at the time. We complain when the foreign minister visits foreign countries. We should be complaining if the foreign minister did not visit foreign countries. Meeting with foreigners is a large part of the foreign minister's job, and it's not always possible for foreigners to get to Canberra for meetings. If this remains the standard of our debate, then we are in trouble as a country. We saw a similar tendency after the shooting down of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, a despicable event that caused the largest single loss of Australian life overseas since the 2002 Bali bombings. At the time, many people asked why Moscow would care what Australia thinks. But as it turned out, a strong response from Canberra influenced the tenor of the global debate. Australia helped to stiffen the West's spine. For a few weeks at least, we put Vladimir Putin off balance, and we drove the subsequent diplomacy in New York. Australia can aspire to play in the big global debates. We should aim for nothing less. But if we talk ourselves down, no one will listen to us. If we take ourselves lightly, we can hardly expect others to take us seriously. I believe our foreign policy debate can be larger than it is. In the 1980s, Australians conducted a lively and intelligent debate on economic reform. We should have a similar conversation in the coming years on Australia's place in the world. The success of the Lowy Institute since its establishment in 2003 by Frank Lowy, itself a large gesture, shows that many Australians are keen to participate in this conversation. We need to start a national conversation about the world. We also need to sharpen our tools for dealing with the world. Australia has some fine diplomats, but they are thin on the ground. Over the past 2 decades, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been neglected and run down. DFAT fields substantially fewer personnel overseas today than it did in the late 1980s. Australia's diplomatic network is the smallest in the G20, sharing last place with Saudi Arabia. Although we've opened several new missions in the past 5 years, our network of 110 missions still looks stunted compared with the OECD average of 131 missions and the G20 average of 189 missions. We have fewer posts than Portugal or Belgium, for example, even though these countries are half our size and enjoy more predictable geopolitical circumstances. Even Greece, which is tiny and broke, has a larger network than we do. This is madness without method. Our neighbourhood is getting both richer and tougher. Great opportunities lie ahead for Australia, as well as serious obstacles. If we are to grasp the opportunities and dodge the obstacles, we'll need to practice vigorous and effective diplomacy, which requires a first-rate foreign service. To her credit, Foreign Minister Julie Bishop recently announced a modest expansion of our diplomatic network. I urge the government to go further and establish new posts in countries where we need more comprehensive diplomatic coverage, starting with China, India, and Central Asia. At the same time, the Abbott government reduced considerably our overseas aid program. Next year's aid budget is projected to be lower as a proportion of our gross national income than at any time in the past 3 decades. I presume this cut was made because it was easy. That does not make it smart. Foreign aid helps us to do good in the world, but it also helps us to do well. It gives our diplomats leverage. It improves our national image. Of course, we must be prudent and discriminating in the expenditure of public money, but aid is a cost-effective way of boosting our soft power. Ladies and gentlemen, we should boost our hard power as well as our soft power. Australia needs a more capable military, one that is able to protect the full breadth of our interests. In the past decade, as the world became less predictable and safe, you might have expected Canberra to increase its military power. Instead, previous governments cut defence spending as a proportion of our GDP to its lowest point since before the Second World War. As defence budgets in Asia waxed, ours waned. A gap opened up between our national interests and our national capabilities. This signalled a lack of seriousness, which is a dangerous signal for a country to send. A more muscular Australian Defence Force would help close that gap. It would better enable us to protect our territory and our citizens and hedge against the alarming scenarios I described in my first lecture. It would lend us weight in the eyes of potential adversaries and earn us influence in the minds of friends and allies. Given the uncertainty about future developments in Asia and the trajectories of both the United States and China, this is an urgent priority for Australia. It will require a larger defence budget. I welcome the progress made by the coalition government in increasing defence expenditure towards 2% of our GDP. In the future, a credible ADF may well cost us more than that. It certainly won't cost less. For Australia, the era of cheap security is over. Surely a country of Australia's size, a country so international in its outlook and connections, can afford a properly resourced foreign and defence policy. I'm not seeking rent, I'm seeking reason. In the future, our prosperity and security will depend on the level of our international engagement, including the work of our diplomats and armed forces. It will also depend on the manner in which we choose to make our way in the world. In my second lecture, I argued that Australia needs to persist with its three-dimensional strategy. We need to maintain an equilibrium between height, our alliance management, width, our multilateral diplomacy, and depth, our Asian engagement. In fact, we need to strengthen our commitment along each dimension. Australia should be a close US ally, a vigorous participant in international institutions, and a leader in Asia. In relation to the first dimension, height, we should continue to work with the United States and other like-minded powers to reinforce the liberal international order on the other side of the world as well as close to home. This doesn't mean we are obliged to support our ally when it is wrong, as it was in the case of the Iraq War. But we should lend a hand when our ally is right. We did this, for example, by fighting beside the Americans in the Gulf War and the Afghanistan War. Australia is a beneficiary of the liberal international order. From time to time, therefore, we must serve in its bodyguard. We should also encourage the Americans to renew their presence in Asia. Far from suggesting they retreat from regional leadership, as some argue, we should urge them to reaffirm it. A robust US presence is necessary to maintain a balance of forces in our region. It's not easy, of course, for us to influence Washington's thinking. During the Second World War, John Curtin told the Parliament that Australia had asked for a direct voice on equal terms with its allies on decisions relating to the Pacific. The weight and authority which that voice might command, he warned, are for ourselves to ensure. Our voice will only command weight and authority if we accompany it with action. That means working with the United States and like-minded countries to support the rule of law and the peaceful settlement of disputes in the region, and to discourage coercion and intimidation. What about the second dimension, width? Australia is a stakeholder in international institutions. We should be a responsible stakeholder. For too long, Australia has endured a sterile debate about the United Nations, dominated by two tribes of pundits, neither of which takes a balanced and realistic view of the international organisation. UN groupies defend the organisation come what may. National interests are always seen as suspect, especially US interests. The blame for mistakes is always laid at the feet of member states. The problems pointed out by critics are waved away to the detriment of the organisation the groupies think they are protecting. In the opposing trenches crouch the UN bashers, who argue either that the international organisation is incompetent or that it's omnipotent. Sometimes they argue both. They complain about the regimes represented in New York, forgetting that an international body should, for the sake of its effectiveness, include states that cause problems as well as those that fix them. It's folly to place the UN on an altar and genuflect before it. But it's equally pointless to fetishise the UN's faults. Hopefully, after Australia's recent successful term on the Security Council, we can leave this barren argument behind us. The UN is an important arena for relations between countries. Let's be pragmatic and get on with using it to further our values and interests. We should aim to sit on the Security Council every dozen or so years. From the time of the establishment of the UN to the end of the Cold War, we were represented on the Council at roughly this frequency. We were then absent from the Council chamber for a quarter of a century. We should get back to our old run rate. Of course, width does not refer only to the UN. We should also be a driving force in the G20 and the East Asia Summit. As I've argued in these lectures, we should help to lead the global debate on climate change. Australia should also look for new ways to nudge the world towards the abolition of capital punishment. Working harder to close death row, rather than simply to get Australians off it, would be in the best traditions of principled Australian diplomacy. It would also shield us from claims of hypocrisy the next time we petition foreign governments on behalf of our nationals. In other words, a new diplomatic initiative in this sphere would conform with our interests as well as our values. Finally, we should start a discussion on reforming the international protection regime, which is grossly inadequate to deal with the refugee crisis we are now witnessing. We should also increase the number of refugees we accept, not just this year, but every year, thereby showing the world that our policies are tough-minded but not hard-hearted. The third dimension is depth. Increasingly, everything we do as a country will be touched in some way by developments in Asia. We need to redouble our efforts to understand Asia and to project Australian voices into Asia. In addition to expanding our diplomatic network, Australia should establish cultural and educational centres in key Asian capitals, modelled on the UK's British Council, Germany's Goethe Institute, China's Confucius Institute, and the Japan Foundation. The Australia Centres would be vehicles to promote Australian ideas, culture and services in Asia. They would host exhibitions and festivals, promote Australian education, arts, science and sport, provide language teaching, act as hubs for existing programs such as the new Colombo Plan, and connect Australians with their Asian counterparts. They would boost our profile and complement our bilateral diplomacy. Our bilateral relations in Asia start, but they must not finish with China. It is in our interest that relations between Canberra and Beijing should be strong, positive and cooperative. This is in China's interest too. Our China policy is properly a mix of engaging and hedging. The key is to find the right mix of the two. Sometimes we engage when we should hedge. On other occasions, we hedge when we should engage. When we were invited to join China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank last year, for example, we hedged for a very long time before we finally engaged. In the end, we only joined the bank after Britain had done so first. Reinforcing our relationship with America does not mean we should run down our relationship with China. On the contrary, we should raise it up. When our interests overlap with China's interests, we should be ambitious about our collaboration. We should look to expand our areas of cooperation, from trade to investment, development, disaster relief, search and rescue, and people-to-people exchanges. Sometimes we will say yes to China when Washington says no. There is no need to view every issue through an alliance prism. But when our interests and China's interests diverge, and in particular on hard strategic issues, then our paths will also need to diverge. When we disagree with China, because disagreements will surely arise, we should be forthright, stating our position with respect, but without equivocation. In these circumstances, it is best to be clear and consistent. In my experience, China appreciates consistency, and China respects strength because it aspires to be strong. China does not respect weakness. China was weak for a long time, and it hated being weak. In dealing with China, then, we should cooperate when we can, disagree when we must, and always be clear and consistent. We must not shrink Asia to the dimensions of China, however. Australia should also work closely with other Asian powers, including Japan, South Korea, India and Indonesia, to contribute to the region's security and prosperity. The goal in all this is to contribute to a stable balance of power in Asia, with a leading role for the United States. We should not overestimate our influence, but neither should we underestimate it. If we are confident and sure-footed, we can contribute to regional peace and prosperity. Australia can weigh in the balance. So much for the content of Australia's foreign policy. What about its character? Just as Australia needs a larger politics, a larger debate and a larger tool chest, I believe we also need a larger foreign policy. This means a greater measure of ambition. It means taking aim at the really big issues. Of course, that ambition needs to be tempered by coherence. We need ambitions, not illusions. Governments that try to do too many things at once do few of them well. We need to align our ends and means and engage in practical, tough-minded diplomacy directed at making a difference. We should try to shape our environment. Australia responds to events with great professionalism, but what are the shaping initiatives in which we are currently engaged? Consider some of the occasions in Australian foreign policy history when ambition met coherence. The negotiation of ANZUS, the Colombo Plan, the 1957 Commerce Treaty with Japan, the recognition of the PRC, the diplomatic campaign against apartheid, our peace initiative in Cambodia, the work of the Cairns Group in support of free trade, the development of APEC, the intervention that helped East Timor win its independence, the restoration of law and order in Solomon Islands. These initiatives were both creative and credible. They took ambition and flair along with persistence, pragmatism and attention to detail. And they took leadership. This is a time of great strategic flux. It's a moment that calls for Australian leadership. Australia is, Clive James once wrote, the birthplace of the fortunate. But we are responsible for much of our own good fortune. We should be unafraid once more to shape our circumstances, trusting in our own abilities and knowing that providence favours those who help themselves. We stand, all of us, said Winston Churchill in 1941, upon the watchtowers of history. Now, as then, the view from the watchtower is disquieting. There are patches of sunshine, but clouds are accumulating. The disposition of forces in the world is changing before us. The old order is giving way to something new. We do not know what it will look like, but we do know that our region will be central to the new order. It's often said that our new circumstances present us with a choice. Should we throw in our lot with our ally, the United States, or our economic partner, China? It's true that we have a choice, but that's not it. Australians are unlikely to opt for a two-dimensional approach. We are predisposed towards a three-dimensional foreign policy. This requires us to work with our global ally, strengthen international institutions, and enliven our connections with Asia, and to manage the tensions between these three imperatives. The real choice we have to make is a different one. Are we content to be a little nation, anxious about the world and disposed to erect barriers against it, with a negative political system and a meanness of spirit about the place? Do we want to be a nation with a limited diplomatic network, a modest defence force and a cramped vision of our future? Do we wish to be a people with a habit of talking ourselves down, who must look elsewhere for inspiration because we don't believe we can fill our highest office from within our own ranks? Or do we want to be larger than this? A big, confident country, open to the world and alive to the attractions of diversity. A nation with a reforming mindset, a generous debate and a serious public life. An ambitious country with the instruments that enable us to influence the balance of power in Asia. A people with enough confidence and self-belief to have our own head of state. Ladies and gentlemen, we need a national conversation about this choice. I hope the men and women of Australia decide to think big. Thank you.
Dr. Michael Fullilove, Executive Director of the Lowy Institute and this year's Boyer Lecturer. If you've missed the first three of Michael's lectures, you can access them on our website. Head to the ABC website, they're all there. And if you hang out till December, you can buy the book as well, because they're all going to be published in a book, which is being published by Penguin. Now, we are going to adjourn shortly for some refreshments, but before we do, we've got time for a Q&A, so I'm going to move on over to the lounge room and ask Michael a few questions, but then I'd like you too, anyone here who has a question, we'll have a little time for your contribution too. Thank you. Michael, you want us to think big. That was your final exhortation. I'm wondering if you're encouraged on that front by some of the signs of, recent signs, very recent, under the new Turnbull leadership. We've got the bid for the UN Security Council. Sure, it's not for 15 years, but it's there. Bid for a place on the UN Human Rights Council. The strong position taken by Foreign Minister Julie Bishop recently on Syria. I think she's really kind of led the US really there. We've also seen this week the strong statements alongside the US on South China Sea, doing exactly what you said in that speech that Australia should do to China, which is speak directly, speak bravely, and not take a backward step. We're not doing too badly right now in thinking big, are we?
I think you're right, that the early signs from the Turnbull government are encouraging. I was encouraged that the Foreign Minister decided to put our name in the hat for the UN Security Council. It's obvious that there's a new lightness, I think, there's a new lightness to Australian politics. I think that Mr Turnbull sees a broader spectrum of colours than his predecessor did. I'm struck even by, for example, the conversation with Australian Muslims, which is an important part of the domestic security debate, how much that's changed. A year ago, if we had been here, we would have been talking about the debate on the burqa ban in Parliament House, and that's almost unimaginable now, I think. So I think that's encouraging, but I would say, Fran, that some of the things Mr Abbott did, I agree with, and I hope that Mr Turnbull sends a signal to that he will persist with them. I respected the fact that Mr Abbott restored credibility to the defence budget. That took choices on his part to try to increase defence expenditure to where it should be. I thought that he conducted our relationship with China pretty well overall as well. So I'm encouraged by the early signals, but I think there's some past policies that he should try to retain.
Oh yes, it would be fatuous to suggest that we've suddenly had this shift in all these issues on Syria or Ukraine or those issues simply in 3 weeks, of course. The consistent element there too is Julia Bishop. It'll be interesting to see if she has quite the same leadership role there with the new Prime Minister. More diplomats, more money for overseas aid, a more muscular defence force. These are all big ticket items. Money is very tight right now. There are major demands at home. You mentioned the debate over the Muslim debate in this country and the debate over counter-terrorism. Very big demands here. So while defence budgets have waned, police and counter-terror budgets have absolutely waxed. Isn't that the right balance and the right priority? Don't you think a lot of Australians would think it would be right to be spending there than further afield right now?
Well, you mean in diplomacy compared to these other issues?
Yeah, I mean, if we have to make choices, and we do, governments are all about making choices.
Well, sure, but let me say two things. First of all, let me give you some context. The DFAT budget will be $1.7 billion out of a federal budget of $430 billion. So $1.7 billion is a large sum of money, but when you think of the value that our diplomats provide in terms of intelligence, assistance to Australians in difficulty, helping us to navigate our way around the obstacles, I think that's money worth spent. So I think some context is useful. The second thing I'd say is, like everything else in politics, as you say, it's a choice. And it depends on how seriously you see the world. If you think we can continue to free ride on US security, which is what we've been doing, then you may well say, let's not bother much about the defence budget, let's not bother too much about the diplomatic budget. But if you think that we are facing a predicament of proximity, if you think that, if you agree that the era of cheap security is over, then these are not luxuries, these are not nice-to-haves, these are must-haves. We need a properly resourced foreign and defence policy.